Hello, my name's Rob Gordon. I've been a psychologist working with disaster recovery for about 30 years now, and I've been down to Mallacoota a number of times, and I've been talking with people in the community in various roles about the common difficulties that aren't just happening in Mallacoota, but not only throughout the Black Summer bushfire scenes, but that I've noticed throughout all sorts of different disasters happening around about the 6-month mark. That's, of course, made a little more difficult here in Victoria because that after bushfires, that 6-month mark is middle of winter, which can present its own problems, particularly for those who aren't in comfortable housing. What I want to do today is share with you some of the observations I've made and the understandings I've gained of what's going on for people around about this time in a recovery cycle. We know that one of the things that is so difficult to understand as people go through recovery is the role of what they've lost. It's very obvious what we've lost in terms of physical possessions and community life and so on. But what I want to emphasize is how, as we go through our daily life, we build up a fabric of assumptions and expectations based on the routine behaviours of everyday life, seeing the same things, talking to the same people. And during that time, building up networks of the people we understand and who understand us, and we've got common interests and common patterns of life, that we don't realise how that is an essential extension of our own thinking processes, our own way of understanding, making sense of our emotions, and giving us a sense of the world being a reasonable, orderly place. Most of all, these patterns, the familiar processes we have, the simple fact that we see people in the street who smile and greet us. They mightn't even say anything, they might just smile at us and go past, they might pass us in the car. That's enough to tell us a couple of things. Firstly, this is somewhere where we belong and we're acknowledged. And secondly, if we're greeted with warmth, then it tells us we're valued, people like us. These are really important parts of our everyday life that we absolutely take for granted. And I think what I want to emphasize is that it's very hard, first of all, to notice them when they're occurring, because if they work, they disappear and just leave us with that sense that we're in a contained and supported environment, and we can then process things as an individual. We can have conversations which we choose to have because there's a background of common understandings which we can draw upon, the history and the nature of our community. When a disaster comes, all of that's out of the window and we're all into survival mode, trying to get by as quickly as we can. At some point that settles, but in the process, you could say people are improvising their day-to-day lives, trying to work things out. There's a lot of helping going on, a lot of closeness, a lot of working together that is outside the structure of our normal patterns and habits. And eventually, for some people, a week, a few weeks, others takes longer, months, things settle. We start to get back into a routine. People start working again, maybe kids going to school or being taught at home, whatever, depending on COVID. And we then get to the point where we start to no longer just look at the immediate here and now, but we start to look ahead. How does this long-term vista of recovery look? How are we going to get through this? What do we need to do? Instead of solving immediate day-to-day problems, we start trying to think about the big problems. That marks a really important shift for the community. because the whole experience of the disaster is outside people's previous experience. The definition of a trauma is something that irreversibly shatters assumptions and expectations and taken for granted attitudes that I've always had, that provide the framework for me to make decisions and give things their meaning and work out what we should do next. And when this is all out the window, well, it's not too much of a problem because we're dealing with immediate day-to-day problems. And when we start to then settle back into a routine, it's not the same routine as we had before because it's grossly affected, no matter what role we have in the community, by this huge event that's touched everybody in some way or another. The experience of the disaster itself is usually very unifying, so much so that everyone feels we've been through this together. We've all survived this huge experience together. And yet, when we get a few months down the track, it's very hard to realise that actually the truth is nobody had the same disaster as anybody else. That many people were profoundly affected. Many people had serious traumas, loss of material possessions, extreme anxiety and worry about loved ones, had frightening experiences and so on. Others maybe evacuated early on, maybe knew that they would probably lose everything, maybe didn't. Very varied experiences. And it's during this period, these first few months, that these differences in people's experience start to show up. And no two people had the same disaster, even in a family. I've heard so many stories about how a husband saw it one way and a wife saw it another. They had completely different estimates of threat and risk. The children saw it differently from the parents. The children saw it differently from each other depending on their age. Everyone had a different experience. What we know is very, very helpful is that people talk about their experience together, and by sharing it, at least understand where the others are coming from, and try to come to some common understanding as a family. Why dad did this, why mum did that, what mum thought was happening when dad thought this was happening, where the kids were, what they saw, how they understood it, because that will explain a great deal. But often in the early time, it's not the time and the leisure or the settled feeling where you can really talk about this stuff. And it also is pretty upsetting because nobody wants to remember that stuff. But it's a bit like, I think, taking a splinter out. It's painful to dig into it with a needle or something and tweezers and pull it out. But we know if we don't pull out those foreign bodies, the healing won't be right. And if we don't pull out the foreign bodies that have got between us, these differences of experience, then everyone starts to develop their own reactions to their own piece. And then we get conflict. During this time, it's inevitable that during this high stress, trying to rebuild life, get it back together again, we are focused on ourselves. That's what the stress response does. That's why it is adaptive. It's adaptive because we focus on what we have to do to get through this. Self-focus on myself, maybe my family, my children. But often, even within families, each person is painfully aware of their own struggle. It's very hard for us when we're in a feeling of pain and emotion to be able to reach out and think about somebody else's point of view. In that sense, it's absolutely inevitable that we become very self-centered when we're in a highly stressed mode. So if we put this picture together of the community in this very cohesive time, and then following a few months, people start to settle in and start to realize, actually, I've got very painful feelings about something, but they don't correspond to what somebody else went through. And another painful thing inevitably comes out, and in every disaster it's spoken about. And that is a very particular feeling that I think is an inevitable consequence of relationships, of caring, of connection. And that is, if something bad happens to somebody I care about, I feel guilty. Not guilty in the sense that I caused it, but guilty in the sense that something painful has happened to somebody else and it didn't happen to me. I wanted to do something to help somebody, and the circumstances prevented me, and they've suffered loss. I feel guilty. I should have done more. And people are always left with this question, what else could I have done? What should I have done? I should have tried harder. I should have done this. I should have gone there. When I'm talking with people, I ask them a single question that's very illuminating. When they get to the point in their conversation, they say, I feel so guilty. I wish I'd done. I should have done this or that. I immediately ask them, why didn't you do it? It's a difficult question because it seems to put the finger right on the sore point. But you know, they always have a reason why they didn't do it. I didn't realise it needed to be done. I didn't realise this was going to happen. I couldn't get there. I realised that if I put myself in that position, I might die and I might not be able to look after my family or whatever. That whatever it is the reason they made the decision they made. And we never know what would have happened if they hadn't made that decision. And so it's like the guilt arises out of a strong emotion of caring and wanting to help, and the experience of failure, and something bad has happened to other people, even our family members. We didn't want them to go through a bad time, and they did. And we lose in the weight of that emotion, we lose the reasons why it unfolded the way they did. And almost always we find that people did the best they could given who they were, what their experience is, and what they thought was happening. All of which might not be adequate to the situation, but we can't choose, can we? We're there and it happens and we do our best. And therefore, I think it's very important for people to name the guilt and notice it, because if we don't name it, some very important things happen. The guilt is a painful experience of being torn apart inside, being separated. What I did is separated from what I wanted to do. And that leaves scope for me to blame and criticize myself. And therefore, in guilt, I'm against myself. That's a very painful, it's like I'm tearing myself apart. It's a very painful feeling. And we get restless, we want to relieve the pain. And a natural way that I notice is absolutely typical dynamic that happens in any situation where guilt comes up, is that it tends to convert into anger. We get angry and frustrated with the people who we feel guilty about if we don't keep our mind on it. And so we get this turbulence of emotions flying backwards and forwards. And it's always happening in every disaster I've ever had anything to do, it's probably several hundred. These elements occur. They also are reported in all the disasters I've read about. It's really important to understand this is normal for disasters. Not normal in the sense it's good and healthy, but normal in the sense is it always happens. And the reason it happens is because people care for each other. They care for their community. They care for the animals. They care for the forest. They care. That's why we live together in communities. But most of the time we don't worry about that care because it's just in the background. It comes into the foreground and stirs up these feelings. And so we put together these strong emotions, which I feel in my way, with my particular meanings, my commitments, what I wanted to do. And we get this very intense preoccupation with what's going on in my mind. And then we notice all these incredible differences. I like to say that nobody had the same disaster as anyone else. Even if they had the same category of damage, they lost their houses. Everybody's house means something different. Everyone had a different life in it. Everyone's lived there for a different length of time. Some people, the house is just a place to sleep, and what's really important is their fishing or their job or their career or something like that. And somebody else, the house is the little cocoon, the nest that they feel is the whole centre of their life. It's full of meaningful objects and sentimental attachments, and it's a very deep loss. You know, so we can't just say that. We can't say that people who didn't get burnt, get their possessions burnt, whose houses were supposedly completely unscathed, we can't say they're unaffected. Everyone in the community is affected. Now, this part of this sort of highly stressed way of thinking puts us into a state of mind that's very adaptive in an emergency, which is to quickly work out what's most important and go for it. But what that inevitably produces as a side effect is a tendency to simplify the problems and put them in an order of severity. And it's been observed. I've read about this in reports when they first started really study disasters in the 1940s in America. Sociologists went out there and they noticed then that people would organise in a series the worst affected and the next worst affected, the next worst, and so on. And the benchmark would be the most profoundly affected person. And then, as part of this sense of commitment to our community, people lower down the pecking order would say, oh, don't worry about me, you know, I only lost this, that and the other. You want to really worry about so-and-so who lost something much more than me. That'd be like after a bus accident or something saying, we really only worry about the person who lost 2 legs. We don't worry about the person who just broke their arm or lost a toe. But this is completely wrong, isn't it? In medicine, we say, actually, we might transport the person with the most serious injuries to hospital first. But eventually we'll get around to everyone and give them all very good care. And I think this is what underlies the fact that's undeniable, is a disaster is a community event and the whole community is affected and everybody is affected in different ways. And it is not helpful to work out who's more affected than somebody else. And I can tell you from my experience in working with people, I think there are people who who didn't materially lose anything, but had, for whatever reason, a very disturbing and frightening experience, who will find it much harder to get over the disaster than some people who lost absolutely everything, but were able to rebuild and had good support and were able to resume their lives. And 10 years later, they're living a good life again, whereas the other person never quite feels safe and comfortable again. And I think it's a very important thing for us to understand. The most precious unit of recovery is the community, the whole community, because that gives us our sense of belonging and security and a sense of who we are and acceptance. And so it becomes most important to safeguard and take care of these reactions. I use a particular metaphor to try and explain the sensitivity that occurs. And that is that I say it's as though in this period people are skinless. They don't have a skin, which means when we've lost the skin, say on a hand, the slightest touch is painful. It's to be a touch, we've got to have dead layers of skin, don't we? The outer 2 layers are dead, and they filter and desensitize us so that the skin allows us to experience touch instead of pain. The equivalent for skin living in our community is the predictable, familiar, routine, taken for granted everyday fabric of life, because we don't need to pay attention to it. And that becomes like our cocoon, our buffer. And then when things impact, they impact against that. Yes, I'll go home to bed. Yes, I'll get up in the morning and do the same things again. So these are all really important parts of the experience, but they've been disrupted for a greater or lesser degree. I think it's a really good point for people to ask themselves, what were the routine things I did every day that really helped to give me security, familiarity, a sense of who I was, a sense that I am living a meaningful life, and when did I express those in a regular way? And am I still doing it? And if not, what am I doing instead? Have I got new routines that express something else value, or am I just rolling along trying to improvise things? People often describe how disorganized their lives are in this time. I think it's terribly important that we try to give them some kind of order. And when we find ourselves in this skinless state, thinking about things from our own point of view, our own self point of view, because I'm struggling so much and I'm hurting and I'm sad, then we need to understand that we have to find our way back into that sense of shared view of things that we've had before. Differences, of course, we have different views on politics and sport and religion and anything else, but they're part of a community of views that we live with each other and we accept each other. But when we're skinless, they become intolerant and we go into conflict against each other, because as part of the survival programming of stress, I'm trying to solve my problems. I'm in a self-centered state where I'm trying to solve my problems, but if they come up against somebody else's problems who's trying to solve their problems, we don't get ground. The capacity for compromise and adjustment, listening and trying to appreciate somebody else's point of view, presupposes a familiar community fabric in which I'm valued, I'm accepted, I'm recognized. And that's all in flux after disaster. I know that a lot of work's been done in Mallacoota and that there's terrific things going on there. It's not that there's none there, it's that this fabric is always tattered and damaged after a disaster. I think it's so important that we understand the process of communication is perhaps more important than the outcome. If people can't come to an agreement, I say it's so important to keep talking, because if they can't come to an agreement, then there's a failure of compromise, a failure of adjustment and seeing other people's points of view, because it probably shows that people are really feeling I've got to have my way, because if I don't have my way, I'm losing a part of myself and the way I am connected with the community, the history that I want to be expressed, etc. We saw this time and again in communities after Black Saturday. It tended to come up not just about rebuilding decisions, but about, say, memorial issues. And I saw some wonderful work done where conversations were started that would go right back away from where should we put the memorial, what should it look like, to what is a memorial for you? And I think these are really important questions, even for people who can't make decisions, or in couples they can't decide what they want to do, for community planning, to actually go right back, right away from the actual thing you're trying to solve and say, what does it mean to us? What are the important priorities? How do we want our community to be? If we want our community to be that way, how would we design a particular building, or how would we plan the things that have to be recreated? Or if I'm going to have a house, can I actually make a shift from fixation on the house I had, which I loved, and I want to replace because I want to fill that empty hole, to suddenly what kind of a house would I like for the future? Where would I like to live? Is this an opportunity for change? Is this an opportunity to reshape our community? We can't think like that when we're in this high stress mode. So I'd say a simple guideline would be, if you can't make a decision, or if there's conflict about a decision, it's probably further back in the chain of connections that there needs to be an opening up and sharing of what does bring us together here. What do we have in common in spite of our differences? And I want to just speak for a minute about how we can think of what are the resilience factors. To my mind, the essence of resilience are to bring back into the foreground those things that are vital and essential for the community life that we associate with this community of Mallacoota. What are the essential things? Now, probably we only thought about them every now and again before the disaster. We took them for granted. We lived with them. And therefore, it's really important to think about it. What does Mallacoota mean? Now, of course, some people are saying it certainly doesn't mean what it used to mean. We had a beautiful environment that we came here for, but now it's blackened and it's filled with bad memories. Yeah, but it will become beautiful again. It will take time. Maybe it'd be a good enterprise to go and visit Macedon and Cockatoo from Ash Wednesday, or other environments, and see how they've become beautiful, thriving environments again. Or maybe even the Black Saturday communities, and see they're still recovering, but 10 years on. So that you're not just attached to the picture you had that's been lost, but you can start to form a new idea. And I think what's so important is to try to think about a way of loosening up our processes so that we can allow creativity to come in, we can allow the flexibility, new ideas, and really that's equivalent to a process of dreaming and imagining together. Dreaming meaning daydreams, just, you know, it could be night dreams too, but daydreams that allow us to be creative and bring in all sorts of different ideas, just to speculate, to allow space to fly kites, so to speak, and put up ideas and see where they lead. And they mightn't actually lead to where you want them to go, but it triggers another idea that does actually become creative. It's a really creative space of conversation that's important. But to do that, we have to understand and try and get out of our self-centered stress mode, which is the most important thing, is to create this free process of communication that will allow people to be influenced by each other. Then we will come up with something in common, rather than entrenching into power groups. I want my way, no, I'm going to have mine. They lead to chronic conflict in communities. And there are plenty of studies of how communities have ended up with really deep fissures in them. There are also plenty of studies how good creative work has been done, and a sense of a new commonality, a new community life comes out of it. It's also one of the resilience factors in marriages and families, that the family and the individuals feel we've actually been able to get through something and solve it. We're proud of the strength we showed, the ability to come together and to hold our core values. The core values are the thing that hold us together. We've got to refine them. And I think there's a lot of talking going on in the process. And one of the questions that people ask is this normal? Is it normal to be angry? Yes, it's normal to be angry and guilty and feel intolerant and feel irritable and feel you've lost your skin. But it's not reasonable. and we want to get back to life being reasonable. And so I think while there are many things that have to be done quickly, if we can't come together on something, I think it's really important to just keep working on it. Just allow the communication to go off into tangents, look at the background issues, look at the meanings, look at what you're trying to do, question where you're going with that. Allow time for people to think about what each other said, rather than feel you've got to solve it here and now this evening. But to talk about it, exchange your views, go away and think about it, come back next week. This is really against the stress agenda, which says we've got to get everything done quickly. Because the important point to remember is it's not going to matter how quickly you achieve things, made decisions, plans, rebuilt things. What matters is that in 5 or 10 years' time, everyone really feels pleased and proud of what they've done and can come together and live in it, whether it be a family or community building or whatever. And so this time is irreplaceable. Time to defuse and de-stress. And I think another thing is really important is how do we nurture and sustain the conversations that will allow for this movement? And I think any of us can just model interest to understand somebody else's point of view. We don't have to make judgments on it. Try and be aware of the judgment, the black and white thinking that says this is good or bad or right or wrong or whatever. Get away from the notion of what have you got to say about this because you didn't lose your house or you weren't seriously affected by this. Nobody's in a right to judge. Like I said, people who were materially unaffected, their lives may be irreversibly changed, and other people whose profound losses will soon be transformed, and they'll be leading creative lives. Not that we want to in any way devalue the loss. Every person's experience is their own experience. And how do we build new memories of taking that sense of togetherness that from the fire and putting it into a togetherness of community process? And there's a lot of guidelines about how to conduct conversations, and there are a lot of people with experience in this. And I'd say it's really important to think about the social process, because we know that communities coming together and forming groups and forming organisations and thinking together and making decisions is the essence of resilience, because you enact the values of being in a community. You portray your interest and commitment in other people. And if we find ourselves at loggerheads with somebody else, maybe it's important for us to actually wonder whether, if that person is not supposedly materially affected, they're really struggling with, we call it survivor guilt, but this guilt that comes from the depth of commitment that person feels to their fellow community members. And it's really important that we respect that, even if that guilt might show up as irritability and anger at some times. In a way, I think often when we let go of the outcome and we just try and give our attention to the process, then we see creative opportunities. We find that if we're not at loggerheads, people will shift their point of view and allow time. There would be, if we had more time, there would be examples we could give of this that have happened. And the most important thing is that we safeguard that quality of community togetherness. That is, without question, one of the most valued survival processes, one of the essences of our community resilience. Thank you.